So you're ready to go on and talk about methods a little bit? Now this is the scary piece for me because there's this tendency on the parts of everybody to move directly to methods. Do not pass go, do not collect $200, spend absolutely no time in the reading. It's just about data collection, right? No. How are you going to know what you're going to be looking for unless you actually have a good mental model? So I'll go back to the example that I used in some of the courses where I've spent a fair amount of time trying to get people to actually use their observational skills and develop theoretical models in their heads before they can actually make use of their observational skills. So I don't know if you remember the story about trying to get students in grade 9 to start using a microscope. And so they would set up a wet mount, so it would be a glass slide with a slight depression in it. I'd put a drop of water in it, then I'd get them to scrape the inside of their cheek and swish the toothpick on the inside into that drop of water, and put a cover slip over it, put it underneath the microscope, and tell them, I want you to draw me a cell. Make it nice and big so I can see all the detail and all that kind of stuff. And so what would I actually get in these drawings back from the students who had never really used a microscope before? They would draw me, I don't know, a piece of breakfast. They would, most of the time, I would get a really, really nice circular cell that had a very, very well-defined membrane and no nucleus, etc. In reality, of course, it was an air bubble. But they had no mental model, they had no theory in their head as to exactly what it was that they were looking for. And as a result, they didn't know what they had seen when they saw it. So they would draw whatever they came across, rather than looking specifically for a cell. The point here is that if you're going to go looking for something, you already have to know what it looks like. Otherwise, you'll never know what it looks like or what it is when you see it. So really where I'm going here is you need to develop this theoretical framework, which is developed to a large extent from the reading, the literature that you have reviewed, which will give you an idea as to what it is that you are going to be looking for. And if you don't do that stuff, then it doesn't really matter what you come up with in terms of data collection. So, moving on then to methods and procedures, the scary part. And so again, what I'm doing is very generally outlining the methodologies here. The actual specific procedures that you're going to be using are a different story, and Elizabeth's going to talk a little bit about that when we get to that point a little bit later on. The first piece, though, the methodologies that we're going to be dealing with. And again, this is as general as all get out because I don't know exactly where you're actually going to be dealing with. And so I'm going to start outlining some very broad categories and then some smaller categories underneath that. And then we'll get to the actual specific procedures themselves, the pieces that you're actually going to be using, things like interviews and surveys and document analysis, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that's the lower part, but we're talking here about the umbrella methods. So in other words, the picture that I'm trying to paint here is that there needs to be a consistency with the storyline all the way through. So you start with the context, you move into the literature review, finding out what other people have found out about this particular area, and then you start dealing with this picture of what it is that you're looking for, that we call the theoretical framework that we're going to talk about next week, and then we're going to be moving on into how are we actually going to be doing this study. So how are we going to scope this study itself? There needs to be a lot of consistency within the context as you move through. So they're all part and parcel of the same stuff. So the elements of proposal, going back to that document again, talk about methodological steps or a series of steps that you're actually going to be taking to answer every question and to test your hypothesis that comes up in your question and hypothesis section, the context and your theoretical framework. The research is plagued by the presence of confounding variables, and you're going to find this all over the place. So that's why I'm saying stick to two variables that you're going to be dealing with. an independent variable, one that you're going to manipulate in some way, shape, or form. And the second one is going to be a response or result variable or dependent variable, if you want to use the typical terminology. Those two pieces are going to guide everything else. Now, what happens with all that other noise that's being talked about in this document? Well, those are all variables that you need to control in some way, shape, or form. In other words, you need to filter those out, and you have to have a good reason for filtering them out. You can't just say, I'm not going to pay attention to those, because those things may actually impinge upon your result variable, your dependent variable. And if you haven't got a way of actually playing with that noise or being able to discount it in some reliable way, then you'll never know what the relationship is between these two variables. And what you need to do is describe the relationship between these two variables without all that other stuff. So that's why Guba and Lincoln and Guba and talk about, oh, I've just lost it. There's a whole bunch of people that Guba has dealt with in terms of these methodologies that we're going to be dealing with. But essentially it comes down to the design section or the methodology section talks about variables you propose to control and how you propose to control them. And this can be done experimentally or statistically, and I'll talk about those methods in a bit. And you also need to talk about the variables that you propose to randomize. In other words, the ones that you're actually going to be focusing on and manipulating in some way, shape, or form. All right, moving on from that. In the hope that I'm not losing you. So the following is simplistic, but a focus on the concept is appropriate. So in accordance with your hypothesis stance, so you've got your hypothesis, identify an independent variable that will be deliberately modified, and then you also need to identify your dependent variable and control everything else. All right, this is actually grade 9 science. Very generally the same way that I dealt with it at that point. Then how do we actually go about looking at this data, and what kind of sense do we make out? Well, there's quantitative methodologies. So take a look at all those studies that usually are experimental in design. That is, they are manipulating the independent variable, and they're taking a look at the dependent variable, but it's always done from the perspective of numbers. So they're manipulating numbers in some way, shape, or form, or they're collecting numbers in some way, shape, or form that they think are related to each other in a correlational kind of fashion, etc. So that's all quantitative, and there's usually a statistical methodology that's actually going to be used for that kind of stuff. And then you need to talk about randomization, or there's all kinds of methodologies. There's also assumptions that you build in. So one of the most general assumptions is that if you've got lots and lots of people, you're going to end up with a normalized curve. You know, a bell curve typically is the terminology that's used in undergrad. That normalized curve may or may not be appropriate for the population that you're dealing with. So the group of individuals that you're actually going to be taking a look at. And here's the point. From my perspective, I'm not a quantitative person. I've dealt with quantitative, and I do use quantitative methodologies quite a bit, but in most instances, you are going to be dealing with such small populations that you cannot assume a normalized curve, normalized distribution. So you're going to be dealing with non-parametrics as compared to parametric statistics. And that just means that you're going to be using other kinds of tests rather than just an ANOVA or an ANCOVA or something along those lines. Don't worry too much about it if you don't recognize that kind of terminology. There's student t-tests. There's all kinds of various tests. And you can look all those things up if you really need to. And you can actually even just plug them into pieces of software that'll do all the calculations for you. And all you need to do is actually be able to recognize the end product, whether it's going to be valid or not. So that's quantitative. Most of you are going to be actually sitting in the qualitative and or mixed methodology kinds of sides of things. That is, taking a look at non-numeric data, and you're usually going to be describing that data in some way, shape, or form. Looking for themes, standard themes that are reoccurring through the actual data itself, and that's going to emerge then as your materials that are going to mean something to you, your findings that Elizabeth was talking about before. Moving on to mixed methodologies, it's combining quantitative and qualitative methodologies together. And there's some neat kinds of ways of doing that, some that are really give you insight in terms of what's actually going on inside the brains of individuals. My favorite technique in this particular area is making use of mixed methodologies, but it's using something called repertory grids. And it's qualitative in nature to a large extent, but it's analyzed quantitatively. And you end up with these graphs being produced as a result of this kind of piece. Anyways, moving on. Methods, resources. Yeah, this is just an opportunity to take a look at a whole bunch of different kinds of things. I've got additional resources that we can take a look at if you're really interested in. There's piles of stuff that's already in the additional resources section of the course. So take a look in Blackboard and go in there on a regular basis, because both Elizabeth and I are adding things to it on an ongoing basis. So don't assume that you know everything that's in there. And I'll be adding some of these pieces in there as well. So some pertinent pieces as we go through. And that brings me to the end. So over to you, Elizabeth. Anything that you want to comment on, add to, or talk specifically about those procedures that we're going to be making use of in each person's work as well.